When I first arrived at Maple Grove Estates, I felt as if I had stepped into a living postcard, a neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly manicured, every mailbox was painted in a precise shade, and an unspoken code of order governed every inch of the community. My name is Jamie, and after years of living in spaces that stifle my creative spirit, I was ready to embrace a new chapter defined by personal expression and quiet rebellion. Yet, from my very first step onto the neatly trimmed sidewalks, I sensed that this was a place where individuality had to tiptoe around an ironclad set of rules. The Homeowners Association wasn't just a bureaucratic necessity here. It was the heartbeat of Maple Grove Estates, ensuring that every detail conformed to its strict standards. As I unpacked my belongings and began to envision my future in this seemingly perfect suburb, I couldn't help but wonder, would my own flair be celebrated or crushed under the weight of tradition? Little did I know, this question would soon be answered in the most unexpected way. Maple Grove Estates wasn't just about immaculate homes. It was a living gallery of enforced uniformity. Every inch of the neighborhood seemed to adhere to an unspoken, yet rigidly enforced, standard of perfection. As I strolled down the sidewalk, I noticed how each house sported the same carefully chosen color palette, and every front yard was a mirror image of the next. There were strict guidelines on everything: the exact shade of green for the lawns, the permitted types of flowers, even the size and shape of decorative accents. Residents carried themselves with a quiet pride, yet underneath, there was a palpable tension. Neighbors would exchange knowing glances, as if silently acknowledging that any deviation from the norm was not just frowned upon. It was a challenge to the very order of Maple Grove Estates. It quickly became clear that the Homeowners Association wasn't a mere formality. It was the strict curator of our collective appearance, with rules enforced by an unwavering committee. In this environment, personal expression was allowed only within a narrow, carefully drawn line. Every choice had to align with the community's stringent aesthetic, and any sign of individuality risked ruffling the feathers of those dedicated to maintaining a picture-perfect facade. Little did I know, these exacting standards would soon become the battleground for a very personal and unexpected rebellion. It wasn't long after I settled into Maple Grove Estates that I encountered the person whispered about in every conversation, the notorious HOA Karen. I first saw her on a brisk morning stroll, clipboard clutched tightly as if it were a badge of office. With her meticulously styled hair, a crisp pastel blouse, and a skirt that seemed to command respect, she moved with an unyielding precision. Every step she took exuded authority, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, missed no detail. Neighbors spoke of her in hushed tones, of her uncanny ability to spot even the slightest deviation from the community's strict aesthetic. As she passed by, I could sense the unspoken warning in the air, a reminder that in this perfectly curated neighborhood, even a minor infraction would not go unnoticed. For many, her presence was a symbol of order. For others, it was a looming threat to any hint of individuality. That day, as I admired my new home, I couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze. It was clear that HOA Karen wasn't merely enforcing rules. She was the living embodiment of Maple Grove Estates' rigid standards, and crossing her path meant entering a world where perfection was not just expected, but demanded. I had always believed that a home should reflect its owner's spirit, and after settling into the rigid order of Maple Grove Estates, I felt the urge to inject a little personality into my surroundings. One crisp morning, as I sat with a cup of coffee overlooking my yard, the idea struck me: why not build a fence that was as unique and vibrant as I was? I envisioned a structure that broke away from the dull uniformity of the neighborhood, a reclaimed wood fence accented with modern iron details, blending rustic charm with contemporary design. This fence wouldn't just serve as a boundary. It would be a declaration of individuality, a subtle rebellion against the cookie-cutter norms enforced by the HOA. Excited by the prospect, I spent weeks meticulously planning every detail. I scoured local salvage yards for the perfect pieces of reclaimed wood and consulted with artisans to ensure the design would be both aesthetically striking and structurally sound. With blueprints in hand and an unwavering determination, I embarked on the project, knowing that this personal touch would not only enhance my home but also quietly challenge the status quo of Maple Grove Estates. One morning, as I stepped outside to admire the fresh lines of my newly installed reclaimed wood fence, a sharp knock at the door shattered the calm. I opened it to find HOA Karen, clipboard in hand and eyes narrowed into a steely glare. Without preamble, she launched into a litany of complaints. The fence's design was non-compliant, its rustic charm an affront to the meticulously uniform aesthetic of Maple Grove Estates, and it was, in her words, an eyesore that must be removed immediately. Her tone brooked no argument. As she listed vague infractions and referenced obscure HOA guidelines, I could see that her mission was to crush any hint of individuality. Standing there, I felt a surge of both indignation and determination. The fence was not just a structure, but a declaration of who I was. In that tense moment, with Karen's rigid authority clashing against my creative expression, I knew that the battle for my home was about to escalate into something far more personal. I stood there, listening to Karen's harsh demands, my mind racing as she continued to lecture me on the supposed violations. The more she spoke, the more my frustration grew. I had spent weeks ensuring everything about that fence adhered to the guidelines that mattered. Even the wood was salvaged with great care, nothing outrageous, nothing radical, yet it felt like the smallest of deviations from the HOA's vision was grounds for punishment. "Karen, I followed the rules," I said, my voice steady despite the tension building in my chest. I checked every guideline and even consulted with experts to ensure that this design was within the parameters. She scoffed. "The design is irrelevant. The HOA is concerned with aesthetic uniformity, and this fence simply doesn't conform. You'll need to remove it by the end of the week or face penalties." I felt a knot form in my stomach. I couldn't afford to rip down the fence, not after all the effort I'd put in. But Karen wasn't giving me any room for negotiation. As she turned her back and walked away with that confident, imposing stride, I knew that something had to give. The rules were written in favor of conformity, sure, but this wasn't just about the fence anymore. This was about striking a balance between community order and personal expression. Then, as I closed the door, it hit me, an idea, one that I could turn the situation completely around. I located the stack of HOA paperwork I'd been neglecting. It was time to find something in those dusty papers, something that could turn the tables, something that would show Karen and the entire HOA that I not only knew the rules, but that I had the power to change them. 4:16 seconds. Stunned by Karen's rigid ultimatum, I retreated to my home office with a storm of questions swirling in my mind. I gathered every piece of HOA documentation I could find, emails, meeting minutes, and even that hefty binder of rules we received upon moving in. As I pored over the labyrinth of guidelines, I was determined to uncover any detail that might justify or challenge her claims. It wasn't long before I noticed something peculiar, a small, almost overlooked note in the minutes of the last board meeting. There, amid discussions about minor infractions and landscaping standards, was a brief mention of a change in leadership. The previous HOA president had resigned, and the vice president was now set to assume the role immediately. My pulse quickened as I scanned the document again and again. Could it be that I, who had barely been aware of my role on the board, was now the new HOA president? The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. Every rule Karen had so zealously enforced was suddenly up for reinterpretation under my own watch. With a newfound resolve, I knew that I was about to flip the script on this long-standing battle between conformity and personal expression. Armed with the undeniable authority of my new role, I knew it was time to confront Karen head-on. The following morning, I invited her to join me in a quiet corner of the community clubhouse, away from prying eyes. With a composed yet resolute tone, I began. "Karen, I've spent the last few days reviewing the HOA guidelines and the recent board meeting minutes. It turns out that I'm now the HOA president." Her eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, the confident facade she'd worn so meticulously faltered. I continued, "This means that moving forward, I have the authority to re-examine and reinterpret our rules, and I believe that my fence is a beautiful expression of individuality that adds character to Maple Grove Estates rather than detracting from it." I laid out the facts calmly. The board's decision, the change in leadership, and the outdated nature of some of our policies. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened as she stuttered a response, clearly unprepared for this reversal of power. The tension in the room was palpable. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about ushering in a new era for our community. In that charged moment, it became evident that the old order was coming to an end. My declaration not only challenged her strict interpretation of the rules, but also signaled a shift toward a more balanced and modern approach. As I looked into Karen's eyes, I saw both the reluctance of someone clinging to past methods and the dawning realization that change was inevitable. The following week, I called a special board meeting to address not only the fence issue, but to set a precedent for a more modern approach to community standards. In the community room, board members gathered in a mix of curiosity and apprehension. I laid out my case methodically, presenting the new guidelines I envisioned and citing specific clauses that allowed for more personal expression while still upholding our community's core values. I emphasized that the outdated, one-size-fits-all policies no longer serve the evolving needs of Maple Grove Estates. As I spoke, it became clear that many board members had grown weary of rigid, inflexible rules. One by one, they shared their own frustrations and ideas for change. The discussion grew passionate, with lively debates about tradition versus innovation. By the end of the meeting, a unanimous vote was cast. The board would not only retract the demand to tear down my fence, but we would also initiate a review of several outdated policies. In that charged moment, as applause quietly echoed around the room, it was clear that a new era was dawning, a community where individuality was embraced alongside tradition, and where the rules were crafted to reflect the voices of all its residents, not just the few. In the days that followed the board meeting, a noticeable shift swept through Maple Grove Estates. The once rigid atmosphere of enforced uniformity gave way to a renewed sense of community and creativity. Neighbors began to share ideas and suggestions for subtle yet meaningful updates to the HOA guidelines, embracing a balance between order and individuality. My reclaimed wood fence, once a flashpoint of controversy, now stood as a proud emblem of this transformation. I often saw residents pausing to admire its rustic charm, a smile on their faces as they recognized that even tradition could evolve. Even Karen, though still a stickler for rules, seemed to carry a softer demeanor, occasionally nodding in acknowledgement when I passed by, as if silently conceding that maybe, just maybe, a bit of personal flair wasn't so bad after all. At community gatherings, conversations turned to how we might modernize our neighborhood standards without sacrificing the care and beauty of our surroundings. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, a shared journey towards a more inclusive, flexible way of living. My victory wasn't just about keeping my fence. It was a spark that ignited change, encouraging everyone to express themselves while still respecting the communal space we all called home. In that moment, standing in front of my home with my fence intact and the community buzzing with new ideas, I realized that true leadership isn't about enforcing old rules. It's about listening, adapting, and paving the way for a future where every voice can be heard. In the months that followed, a remarkable transformation swept through Maple Grove Estates. My reclaimed wood fence, once a battleground, had become a proud emblem of change, a symbol of the community's newfound balance between order and individuality. Neighbors began sharing ideas on how to update other outdated rules, and the once feared HOA meetings turned into lively forums of creativity and compromise. Even HOA Karen, whose unyielding enforcement had long cast a shadow over our neighborhood, started to temper her rigidity. I noticed her softening at community gatherings, offering cautious nods of approval as residents discussed the benefits of a more modern, inclusive approach. It wasn't about abandoning tradition, but rather about evolving together. Standing in my yard on a warm, golden evening, I looked at my fence and felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just for the design, but for what it represented. It was a testament to the power of collaboration and the courage to challenge the status quo. Maple Grove Estates was now a place where every voice could be heard, where personal expression and community harmony coexisted, and where even the strictest rules could give way to a brighter, more inclusive future. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of Maple Grove Estates was unmistakable. Neighbors who once tiptoed around strict rules now gathered to discuss new ideas and share laughter over impromptu community events. My reclaimed wood fence, which had once been the focal point of controversy, now stood as a proud symbol of change, a tangible reminder that progress is born from the courage to challenge the status quo. At community events, residents spoke of a renewed sense of unity and creative spirit, buoyed by the updated HOA policies that balance tradition with personal expression. Even Karen, once the unyielding enforcer of outdated rules, began to see the benefits of a more flexible, inclusive approach. Though she still maintained her role, a subtle shift in her demeanor suggested that she too was learning to embrace the evolving spirit of our neighborhood. Standing on my porch, I watched as Maple Grove Estates blossomed into a community where every voice could be heard and individuality was celebrated. It wasn't just about a fence, it was about reimagining what our neighborhood could be. With a heart full of hope and a renewed commitment to fostering a welcoming, dynamic environment, I knew that this was only the beginning of a brighter, more inclusive future for us all. In the months that followed, Maple Grove Estates transformed into a community defined by collaboration and renewed spirit. The board's revised policies now embraced a balance between orderly tradition and personal expression, and even Karen, while still a guardian of standards, began to exhibit a touch of flexibility in her approach. Neighbors gathered over morning coffees and impromptu block parties, each celebrating the freedom to add their unique touches to an evolving landscape. My reclaimed wood fence, once a battleground, now stood proudly as a beacon of change, a lasting symbol of how courage and conviction can redefine community norms. As I watched the vibrant exchanges and new friendships blossom across our streets, I knew that Maple Grove Estates had entered a bright, inclusive new era. This wasn't just the resolution of a long-standing dispute. It was the dawn of a future where every voice was heard and individuality was celebrated alongside tradition, forging a legacy of unity and creativity for generations to come.